Welcome back, America. Bob Dylan, The Times They Are Changing, gets a shout-out in this brand-new Vince Flynn denied access thriller. You know, Mitch Rapp is back, of course. And Don Bentley is the author of this new Mitch Rapp novel, Denied Access. And I think Don must like Bob Dylan because he got the shout-out, Don. Is that why?
You know what? Based on your recommendation, my wife and I went and saw the Bob Dylan movie, and it was pretty fantastic. Obviously, he was a wee bit before my time, but fantastic movie, great musician.
Way before your time, and indeed a lot of denied accesses before your time. So I want to know how. I've been reading Dayton and Le Carre since I was 20 and 18 years old. How in the world did you slip so well, and you really do, into their technique and their mindset? It is post-Soviet Union Russia, but nevertheless, Lubyanka is still there.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. I think all of us who write in the military thriller slash political thriller genre, if you asked us what we wrote, we'd say espionage fiction, of course. Kind of like if you ask a commercial fiction writer, they'll tell you they want to write literary fiction. And so this was really my first attempt to write a no-kidding espionage fiction book. And I had some help. As you said, I was in, I think, high school when the Berlin Wall came down. I remember seeing that happen in real time, and like everyone else, thinking we were on the cusp of waking up from history. And so for this one, I wanted to get in the head of somebody who was there. And so a good friend of mine, novelist David McCluskey, put me in touch with a guy named Milt Bearden. And Milt, it was a CIA officer who wrote the book The Main Enemy, and he was chief of the Near East Division as the Soviet Union was crumbling. And he really put me in the head of those folks who were in Moscow Station at the time, who were watching history unfold around them and then trying to figure out what that meant for us and what that meant for the world.
I thought it's a fabulous book, by the way, for the audience. If you really want to be entertained, get Denied Access. And you'll be entertained by Don Bentley. He's done it before. But this setting is so old school, and the techniques they're using is so old school. We got Stan Hurley back. We got Stansfield back. We got Irene is back. Everybody's back, but they're back from 30 years ago. And what I loved about this is it was seamless. I reread the Le Carre trilogy probably 5 years ago. This was seamless. So how did you get ready for this, Don? Did you go back and read all those old ones?
I did, and I read. So the interesting thing about Vince, so I'm a huge fan of the genre anyway, obviously, and I think in the current set of writers, you have people like Daniel Silva who does it amazingly, and also, like I said, David McCluskey. But I really went back to Vince's first two books because he did such a fantastic job of leaving little threads in his book for people to pull on. And his first two, this is Denied Access, is the third book in a trilogy. The first two were American Assassin and Killshot, that really tell Mitch Rapp's origin story. And so as I was looking at that and thinking, hey, where do I want to go with this? Throughout Vince's books, he made this reference to Thomas Stanfield having served in the OSS and the CIA's predecessor. And the founder of the OSS was a guy named Wild Bill Donovan, who, when someone asked him, hey, you're trying to recruit Americans who are crazy enough to parachute behind enemy lines at the time to run partisan resistant groups against the Germans, who are you looking for? And Wild Bill Donovan famously said to him, I want PhDs who can win a bar fight. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to write that scene where Thomas Stanfield is in the wrong side of, or it wasn't even the Berlin Wall, the wrong sector of Berlin, watching the Soviets, because it was this super fascinating point in history where the Soviets had been our notional allies through World War II, and we couldn't figure out what that meant after World War II. There were some within the OSS that thought maybe they'd continue to be our friends. There were some who had a more realistic view of the world and said, nope, these are going to be our adversaries. And I wanted to show the reader which side Thomas Stanfield was going to fall under. And so the book actually opens with that.
There are quite a few bar fights, in fact, in Denied Access. And I will say this before we go to break, Don, and we'll come back and play part two in hour three and put a lot on the web as well. I am very glad that Chris Hendrick played for the Buckeyes volleyball team. I know you're for a Buckeye. I'm a Buckeye. But I'm very glad that Chris Hendricks is a Buckeye. I'm not going to say anything more about Chris Hendricks other than she was a Buckeye, and that's an homage I caught. Do you work one into every book?
I try to. Some of the fun stuff is just putting Easter eggs in the book. And so Chris Henrik in real life is a super Mitch Rapp fan, and it was awesome to put her in the book.
And Ilya Lebedev, who I'm not going to tell anyone about, speaks with an Ohio accent. I like that too. Don't miss Dom when he comes back for hour 3. Go get Denied Access right now. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. In the first hour, you heard me talking with Don Bentley about his brand new novel, Denied Access. It is the latest in the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series. Denied Access is a thriller, but it's also espionage. I want to go back, Don, and talk a little bit about Commissioner Bill Fay. Now, I'm not giving anything away. I don't do that. But it's interesting to grab that character. You don't say what he's a commissioner of. It becomes evident later. But he's described as he had a critical, albeit inglorious, role in the federal government. And it's wonderful to see him go to work and make things work the right way. So how familiar are you with the vastness of the federal government?
So I was an FBI special agent for a couple years, so I have an inkling of how the federal government works. I know you had a position in the Reagan administration, and so certainly not that esteemed in the government. But I think, one of the fun things that when I got to talk to Milt Beardman, who again was a CIA officer and was head of the Near East Division and actually went over to Moscow Station during this time, was I asked him about something called Moscow rules. And so it's this concept where in Moscow, the old gentlemanly rules of espionage don't apply. And what that means is kind of if you're a fan of that Untouchables movie that, you send one of ours to the hospital, we send one of yours to the morgue. And so I asked him about that, and I'm like, were the Moscow rules, did that really apply? And he said, absolutely. He said, if 2 FBI agents got a little frisky rolling up a KGB officer in Washington, D.C., he said, and the next day, a couple of KGB officers would separate a shoulder of some CIA officer in Moscow. And so I really kind of wanted to show some of that tit for tat and how escalation on one side of the ocean might prompt a response on the other. And Mr. Bill Fay was part of that.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember the movie Spy Games with Robert Redford and Brad Pitt, but at one point, Redford calls up a guy who's just a guy who's never had a call from the agency before, and he leans on him to do something, and he does it. And so one of the middle management guys calls the FCC to get a story discredited. And I read this and immediately thought, Spy Game, that is the height of the crap. Let's talk about Moscow Station, which was, I didn't know anyone at Moscow Station. I knew people in the Nordic regions and other countries bordering Soviet countries. And I was in the middle of this a little bit as a kid, not with any authority, but briefcase carrying stuff. My question is, did you go back and find out the actual case files, like the Venona transcripts came out, what we did in Moscow Station pursuant to Moscow rules?
So I relied mainly on 2 books. One was The Main Enemy by Milt again, and then there was another one, I think it was actually called The Year of the Spy, where it talked about there was a period of time where American recruited assets, so Soviets that American CIA officers had been recruited, were getting rolled up by the KGB at an alarming rate, and nobody could figure out why. Now, I'll give away the spoiler. What was actually happening is there was a mole in the CIA named Aldrich Ames and one in the FBI named Robert Hansen, who were just handing over to the KGB every asset that we were running. But at the time, both organizations kind of pointed fingers at the other, and no one understood how it was happening. And so the way that played out in real life is over, and I can't remember whether it was a year or a year and a half time, in Moscow Station, there was just a staggering number of their assets that were rolled up, to the point that the men and women of Moscow Station had convinced themselves that the Soviets, the Russians there, had developed some sort of new surveillance technology that they could not combat. And so Milt said he knew it was bad, that when he paid a visit to Moscow Station and they went into kind of the Holy of Holies, the Yellow Submarine is what they called it, that was kind of their variation of a skiff, the most secure place inside the embassy, inside the CIA annex. And he said the chief of Moscow station looked at him and he said, sometimes I think they can even hear us in here. And it was, and to Milt, as he relayed that story to me, it was the Soviets had so penetrated, American intelligence operations that we were now jumping at our own shadows, and he had to figure out a way past that. And I really wanted to show that sense of despair in this book.
I think that your rendering of the problems at Moscow Station after the Soviet Union collapsed in the book, Denied Access, is superb. I mean, it's very, very nail-biting. Let me ask you about the shout-out to Tom Clancy and the Cardinal of the Kremlin. Again, I've been reading these books for 45 years. That goes way back. That's what, 88? I'm in the administration. Yeah. Clancy was a must-read because President Reagan carried around Hunt for Red October under his arm. So everybody read everything by Clancy that came out. Why did you pick that book to name?
Yeah, so I was, Clancy really opened this genre, or maybe was the next generation of this genre. It was kind of the techno thriller, spy thriller. And when I was a kid, I had a next door neighbor whose parents were perhaps a little more permissive than mine, and he would smuggle me the Clancy books. And so the first one I read was Red Storm Rising, and then I read them out of order, and then Hunt for the Red October. And I just remember Cardinal in the Kremlin, and there's this great scene in which one of the iconic Clancy characters, a woman named Mary Pat, who was a CIA officer but was also a mom, and passes a brush pass to her Soviet asset at a hockey game as she's watching her kids play hockey. And to me, that's one of the quintessential things of this genre, is you have this ordinary person, who CIA officers often are, who is at her kid's hockey game and is still managing to conduct business and do a brush pass. So I really wanted to give out a shout out, not only to Tom Clancy, but to that book in particular.
Well, it was I like that it revived the memory of how superb that thriller was. I have to go back and read that because it was more espionage, less techno thriller like Red Storm Rising, but it was very, very well done. Let me talk to you a little bit about the revival of Stan Hurley and creating basically his legend. He's been around for a while. He showed up in some of Vince's early books. There are references, but he's operational here. Is that the first time Hurley's been operational?
So I think it's the first time, certainly, that he's been operational during the Cold War. And so what made Denied Access really fun to write is it actually spans about 50 years. And so what you have is Thomas Stanfield, like I said, is a young OSS operative. And what you don't realize is that he meets his counterpart, who becomes a senior member of the KGB in the closing days of World War II, and it carries forward to the 90s. And so I thought, I need to show something of what's happening during the height of the Cold War. And what better way to do that than to show Stan Hurley working on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall? And so Vince, in I think Kill Shot, alluded to something that Stan Hurley did back in the day. And one of the fun parts about this job is you get to, like I said, flesh out those loose threads that Vince let dangling. And so the readers, for the first time, I think, get to see Stan Hurley working operationally in East Berlin. And it was a ton of fun to write.
It's a fabulous scene in the bar at the end, but I'll leave that for people to read. Couple of shout outs. I appreciate that you gave props to the State Department Diplomatic Security Service. Mm-hmm. They are, you say this on page 22, among the world's best close protection officers. I don't think America even knows about them, Don. I don't know that I've ever seen in all the stacks of thrillers that I've read, because it's my drug of choice on airplanes. I don't think I've ever seen the State Department Security Service referenced before.
So to be fair, I wasn't terribly familiar with them until I met a man who I actually made a character in this book with his permission, and that's Fred Burton. And so Fred Burton, actually, he has a fantastic book that's called Beirut Station, I believe, where he tells the tragic story of William Buckley, and Fred was actually one of the agents that was involved in the hunt for William Buckley. So William Buckley was the chief of station there, who was captured and horribly tortured and finally killed by a variety of different terrorist organizations. And so that book is phenomenal. And getting to know Fred, I got to understand more of what the DSS actually does. And I thought, who better to protect Irene Kennedy than Fred Burton, a real-life hero?
Oh well done. And he must like this. I think he has to. Now a question, another uh, tradecraft that I didn't recognize is the heat state, meaning the state of
Yeah.
surveillance presently on any member of our undercover team or even our overt diplomats. I've never heard the term heat state. Is that a term of art?
Yeah, so it's one that's used a lot in law enforcement, but as I was looking through the espionage books too, it was also referenced. And so what you're referring to is that every CIA officer, part of their job is to keep track of whether they are under surveillance or not. Because even in Moscow, that's part of where the title of the book comes from. It was actually denied area, and the publisher changed it to denied access. But Moscow Station, Moscow, that area, because there was such a big KGB presence, was known as a denied area, meaning that the KGB counter-surveillance teams could keep track of a lot of the CIA officers during their day-to-day work. And so your job as a CIA officer when you came to work every day was to potentially sit down with the chief of station and say, this is what my heat state is. Either I'm being followed, I think I'm being followed overtly, because they would then use that information to say, okay, if you're going to go meet with an asset, or potentially, as you get to see in the book a little bit, is how can we use that if you're being watched but I'm not, to drag your surveillance team to another part of the city. And so that's really a lot of the fun. Espionage novels at their core are chess matches. And so part of that chess match from a surveillance perspective is to be able to detect a surveillance team without them realizing that you've detected them. At the same time, they're trying to surveil you without you realizing that you're under surveillance. And so heat state is a part of that.
Last two bits of acknowledging what makes denied access so good. The first is you've got a scene. Did you ever read W.E.B. Griffin when he wrote all those books, the sergeants, the lieutenants, the captains?
So he's about the only one in this genre I haven't read, unfortunately.
He's really more military than either techno or espionage, but he always
Okay.
included a satisfactory bit of dressing down of the office jerk. And you do that with Thomas Stansfield over the secure line with the jerk of the office
Yeah.
in Moscow Station. It's always there. It's like it's an emotionally satisfying, got nothing to do with donuts, but it's emotionally satisfying. I also want to talk about the fact that we're going to add another country here, but it's early on, so I don't mind tipping it.
Yeah.
You're in Riga and Barcelona and places like that. Do you go or do you just read about them?
So I try and go as many as I can. Another great writer who's been on your program many times, Brad Taylor, is a friend of mine, and he has this saying that when he does research trips, what he ends up writing about, he said, 10% of it is when he went there to find, and 90% of it finds him when he's there. And so I was lucky enough my son just graduated college a little over a year ago, and he did a study abroad in Barcelona, and so we got to go with the family. And
Bingo.
as we're on vacation, I'm always looking and thinking, what else can I put in? But I think the country, one of them that you were going towards, was Latvia, which unfortunately
That's
I've
what I
never
meant,
been able. Yeah, I've never been able to visit that. But again, another super interesting bit of history there as the Soviet Union fell, and some potential false flag operations that were first the Soviets and then the Russians were waging. And I thought that would be perfect for this book too. And so I pulled that in.
Last question. Because of Zeke, I'm not going to say anything about it other than Zeke. I now know more about polygraphs and about dead drops and tying your shoes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Obviously, Zeke is still there. So that tells
Yeah.
me there's another in the denied access series. Am I right? I hope there is.
There could be. I'm about halfway through the next book. I never talk about works in progress, but since this is the Hugh Hewitt show, I'm willing to let your audience know Mitch Rapp is in the next book. And so that's what I'm willing to drop on your show right now for you.
Well, I'm not going to mention the name of who I think is a great spin-off character that Don Bentley's going to be running with for years, but she's a young agent in Moscow Station. That's my guess. Don Bentley, I hope it's selling like hotcakes. Denied access, fabulous book. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Hugh.